They tell us that China behaves the way it does today because it seeks dominance, but what they rarely explain is that this behavior is rooted not in confidence, but in fear. A fear born from a historical trauma so severe that it permanently altered how an ancient civilization understands power, security, and survival. For more than 2,000 years, China believed it stood at the center of the world, not as a conqueror, but as a civilizational reference point, a place where order, culture, law, and morality flowed outward to less developed societies. This worldview, known as Tianxia, meaning all under heaven, was not merely philosophy. It was the operating system of the Chinese state, shaping diplomacy, trade, hierarchy, and identity across East Asia for centuries. Under this system, China did not see foreign nations as equals, because equality implied rivalry, and China believed it had already won history long before others arrived. By the late 18th century, during the height of the Qing Dynasty, China governed over 300 million people, controlled the world's most productive agricultural economy, and produced a staggering share of global manufactured goods, while Europe, fractured by wars and revolutions, struggled to keep up. Foreign merchants were allowed into China only under strict conditions, limited to the southern port of Canton, forbidden from traveling freely, forbidden from negotiating terms, and expected to accept Chinese authority without question. For China, this was not isolation, it was stability, a belief that civilization did not need to chase change, because change would eventually return to it. But outside China's borders, the world was transforming faster than anyone in Beijing realized, and the force driving that transformation did not care about tradition, hierarchy, or moral order. It was industrial power. By the late 1700s, Britain had become addicted to Chinese goods, especially tea, silk, and porcelain, and this addiction created a massive problem for the British Empire, because China had little interest in British products, demanding payment almost exclusively in silver. Year after year, ship after ship, British silver flowed east, draining the imperial treasury and threatening Britain's ability to finance its expanding global empire. By 1793, Britain attempted diplomacy, sending Lord George Macartney to the Qing court to request open trade relations and permanent diplomatic representation, but the Qianlong Emperor rejected the proposal outright, famously declaring that China possessed all things in prolific abundance and had no need for foreign manufactures. From the Chinese perspective, this was confidence. From the British perspective, it was obstruction. And Britain would not accept economic decline simply because China refused to change. So Britain chose a solution that would permanently scar China's memory of the West: opium. Grown in British-controlled India, opium was smuggled into China in increasing quantities throughout the early 19th century, despite being illegal because British traders understood exactly what it would do to Chinese society. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese citizens were addicted, including soldiers, scholars, officials, and laborers, while silver began flowing out of China at an alarming rate, destabilizing the economy and corroding the state from within. The Qing government could no longer ignore the crisis, and in 1839, the emperor appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu, a rare figure in a decaying bureaucracy, known for his integrity, discipline, and refusal to tolerate corruption. Lin did not hesitate. He arrested dealers, shut down distribution networks, and confiscated more than 20,000 chests of opium, which he publicly destroyed by dissolving the drug and dumping it into the sea near Canton. From a Chinese perspective, this was a moral act, an attempt to protect society from collapse. From Britain's perspective, it was a direct attack on property, profit, and imperial authority. In 1840, British warships arrived on China's coast, and what followed was not a war in the traditional sense, but a demonstration of how brutally unprepared China was for the modern world it had ignored. The Qing Navy was large but outdated, built for ceremonial power and regional defense, not industrial warfare, while British steam-powered ships, reinforced with iron and armed with modern artillery, tore through coastal defenses with terrifying efficiency. Battles that should have taken weeks were decided in hours. Fortresses fell with minimal resistance, and entire river systems were forced open, exposing the empire's heartland. By 1842, China had lost the First Opium War, and the treaty imposed afterward was not designed to restore peace, but to permanently weaken Chinese sovereignty. The Treaty of Nanjing forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 treaty ports to foreign control, and grant extraterritorial rights to British citizens, meaning foreigners on Chinese soil were no longer subject to Chinese law. For the first time in its recorded history, China had lost control over its own territory without being fully conquered, and that realization shattered the psychological foundation of the empire. Because if the emperor was no longer protected by heaven, then the mandate of heaven itself was in question, and once that belief collapsed, so did obedience. Rebellions erupted across the countryside, the most devastating being the Taiping Rebellion beginning in 1850, a civil war fueled by religious fanaticism, economic despair, and political collapse, resulting in the deaths of more than 20 million people. While China bled internally, foreign powers returned externally, demanding more concessions, more ports, more privileges, and more influence, each treaty more humiliating than the last. The Second Opium War ended in 1860, with foreign troops marching into Beijing and burning the old summer palace, a cultural treasure filled with centuries of art, history, and identity destroyed deliberately as a warning that resistance would be punished. This was not just military defeat. It was psychological annihilation. Chinese scholars would later call this era the century of humiliation, stretching from 1839 to 1949, 100 years in which China was systematically forced to accept its weakness, sign unequal treaties, and watch outsiders dictate its future. But the most important consequence of this trauma was not loss of land or wealth. It was memory. A collective memory that taught one brutal lesson above all others. Weakness invites destruction. By the late 19th century, China was no longer asking how it could reclaim its place at the center of the world, because the deeper question had become far more desperate, which was how a civilization that once believed itself eternal could now be falling apart in front of its own eyes. The Qing Dynasty still existed in name, but in reality it had become a hollow shell, unable to defend its borders, unable to control its economy, and unable to command loyalty from a population that no longer believed heaven stood behind the throne. Foreign powers carved China into spheres of influence without formally colonizing it, because they did not need to, as railways, ports, banks, and legal privileges gave them everything they wanted, while leaving the Qing government to absorb the blame. Chinese intellectuals watched this unfold with growing panic, because every attempt to modernize seemed either too slow, too shallow, or sabotaged by corruption and foreign interference. Some argued that China needed Western technology without Western values, while others believed that adopting foreign ideas was itself a betrayal of Chinese identity, creating a bitter ideological war inside the country long before bullets were fired. By 1895, the illusion that China was still a regional power collapsed completely after its defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, when a rapidly modernized Japan, once a tributary state, crushed China in less than a year and seized Taiwan and influence over Korea. This defeat cut deeper than the Opium Wars because it forced China to confront a humiliating truth, which was that another Asian civilization had learned from the West faster, adapted better, and now stood above China on the global hierarchy. For many Chinese reformers, this was the final proof that tradition alone could not save the nation. For conservatives, it was proof that abandoning tradition had already doomed it. In 1898, a group of reform-minded officials launched what became known as the 100 Days Reform, an ambitious attempt to restructure education, military organization, industry, and governance almost overnight. The reforms failed. They failed not because the ideas were wrong, but because the state was too fragile, too divided, and too afraid of losing what little authority it had left. The conservative faction within the Qing court, led by Empress Dowager Cixi, crushed the reformers, executing some, exiling others, and sending a clear message that survival mattered more than transformation. That decision sealed the dynasty's fate, because by suppressing reform, the Qing regime confirmed what many Chinese already suspected, which was that the old system could not be fixed, only replaced. In 1900, this desperation exploded into violence during the Boxer Rebellion, a chaotic uprising driven by anger at foreign influence, Christian missionaries, and economic collapse. The Boxers believed spiritual rituals could make them immune to bullets, a tragic symbol of how powerless the population felt against modern weaponry and foreign domination. When foreign legations in Beijing were attacked, an eight-nation alliance responded with overwhelming force, invading northern China, looting cities, executing civilians, and imposing yet another crushing indemnity on the Qing government. By the time the dust settled, China was poorer, weaker, and more humiliated than ever before, and the lesson was unmistakable. China could not expel foreigners without first rebuilding power. In 1911, the Qing Dynasty finally collapsed under the weight of its failures, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. But the fall of the emperor did not bring stability, peace, or dignity. It brought chaos. The newly formed Republic of China lacked unity, authority, and legitimacy, quickly fracturing into regions controlled by warlords who ruled through violence and personal loyalty rather than law. Foreign powers continued to manipulate China's weakness, backing different factions, extracting concessions, and ensuring that no central authority could fully reassert control. For ordinary Chinese citizens, life did not improve because the empire was gone, but humiliation remained. This was the environment in which a new generation of thinkers emerged, young intellectuals who had grown up watching their country fail, fall, and submit, and who were no longer interested in compromise. They wanted answers, they wanted blame, and most importantly, they wanted a system that would never allow China to be weak again. In 1919, these tensions erupted during the May 4th movement, when students took to the streets after learning that Chinese territory had been transferred to Japan at the Treaty of Versailles, despite China having fought on the Allied side during World War I. To many Chinese, this betrayal proved that Western ideals of justice and equality were selective, applied only when convenient and meaningless when power was unequal. The protests were not just political, they were cultural. They rejected old traditions, old hierarchies, and old beliefs that had failed to protect the nation. Out of this intellectual vacuum, radical ideas found fertile ground, especially Marxism, which offered something China had not seen before, a promise of strength through unity, discipline, and total control over society. In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was founded, not as a dominant force, but as a response to humiliation, fragmentation, and the belief that only a revolutionary system could prevent China from being exploited again. Its leaders framed history as a struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor, a narrative that perfectly matched China's recent experience with imperialism. Meanwhile, the Chinese Nationalist Party attempted to unify the country through military campaigns, but internal corruption, factionalism, and reliance on foreign support weakened its legitimacy. As Japan expanded aggressively into Manchuria in 1931, and then launched a full-scale invasion in 1937, China once again found itself fighting for survival against a technologically superior enemy. Cities fell. Civilians were massacred, and the state barely held together. The trauma of foreign invasion was now layered on top of decades of internal collapse, reinforcing a belief that chaos and weakness invited annihilation. When World War II finally ended in 1945, China emerged devastated, exhausted, and fractured, setting the stage for a final confrontation over who would define its future. By 1949, China was no longer choosing between political systems, because the real choice it faced was between fragmentation and survival, and for a population that had endured invasion, famine, warlordism, and betrayal, survival mattered more than freedom. When Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, it was presented not as the birth of a new ideology, but as the end of humiliation, the moment when China would finally stand up and never be pushed around again. Mao did not frame communism as a foreign import, even though its roots were European, but as a cure for China's historical weakness, a system designed to eliminate the internal divisions and external vulnerabilities that had allowed foreign powers to dominate the country for a century. The message was simple and powerful. China had been humiliated because it was divided, because elites betrayed the people, and because the nation lacked centralized strength, and therefore only absolute unity under a single authority could guarantee safety. This idea became the foundation of the new state. Political pluralism was not treated as diversity of thought, but as a threat because disagreement had become synonymous with instability, and instability was remembered as the doorway through which invasion always entered. Land reforms were violent and uncompromising, not only to redistribute property, but to destroy old social hierarchies that Mao believed had weakened China from within. Millions were publicly denounced, imprisoned, or executed, not as random cruelty, but as part of a calculated effort to erase alternative power structures that could challenge central authority. The trauma of humiliation had taught one lesson above all others, which was that mercy toward internal rivals often resulted in collapse. As the Cold War intensified, China's leadership viewed the global order through the same lens of historical memory, seeing international relations not as cooperation between equals, but as a constant struggle between dominance and subjugation. When China entered the Korean War in 1950, fighting the United States and its allies to a standstill, the conflict was framed domestically as proof that China could now resist the strongest foreign powers and survive. This victory narrative mattered more than the enormous human cost, because it reinforced the belief that strength, sacrifice, and discipline were the only shields against humiliation. But trauma does not disappear when power is regained. It often turns inward. In the late 1950s, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to force China into rapid industrialization and self-sufficiency, driven by the fear that dependence on foreign technology or aid would recreate vulnerability. The policy failed catastrophically. Agricultural collapse, false reporting, and unrealistic production targets led to one of the deadliest famines in human history, killing tens of millions of people between 1959 and 1961. Yet even this disaster did not weaken the core belief that centralized control was necessary, because acknowledging systemic failure would mean admitting that the trauma-driven doctrine itself was flawed. Instead, blame was redirected and fear deepened. In 1966, Mao launched a cultural revolution, mobilizing youth to attack perceived enemies of the revolution, including teachers, intellectuals, officials, and even longtime party members. The stated goal was ideological purity, but the underlying function was control, because Mao understood that the greatest threat to authority came not from foreign armies, but from internal dissent. History was rewritten. Traditional culture was attacked. Loyalty replaced competence. And chaos was tolerated, even encouraged, as long as it did not challenge the supremacy of the party. For a generation of Chinese citizens, trauma was no longer just remembered, it was lived, as families were torn apart, trust dissolved, and survival depended on conformity. When Mao died in 1976, China was exhausted, isolated, and economically stagnant. But the core lesson of the past century remained untouched, which was that weakness invited exploitation and control prevented collapse. Deng Xiaoping would later reform China's economy, opening it to global trade and investment, but he never dismantled the political architecture built on trauma. Markets were allowed, dissent was not. The memory of humiliation, invasion, and chaos had become institutionalized, shaping a system where stability was valued above all else, even at the cost of individual rights. And every time China faced internal unrest or external pressure, its leaders responded not with openness, but with tighter control, because history had taught them that uncertainty was dangerous. This doctrine would guide China's rise in the decades that followed, influencing how it dealt with protests, borders, information, and foreign powers alike. But the most revealing part of this trauma-driven system is not how it controls its people. It is how it reacts when it feels threatened. By the early 21st century, China had achieved something its leaders once believed was impossible, which was rapid economic growth without political collapse, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty while remaining firmly under the control of a single ruling party. To outside observers, this looked like confidence, even arrogance, but inside the system it felt more like walking on a narrow bridge over a deep historical abyss. Because economic success did not erase memory, it amplified it. Every factory built, every port expanded, and every technology acquired was seen not just as progress, but as insulation against the return of humiliation. China's leadership watched the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 with quiet horror, not because communism failed, but because a powerful state dissolved when control weakened, reinforcing the belief that reform without authority leads to disintegration. From that moment forward, political stability became non-negotiable, and anything that threatened it, no matter how small, was treated as an existential risk. Protests were not seen as expressions of grievance. They were seen as the first crack in the wall. This mindset explains why events like the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests were not remembered internally as debates about reform, but as near catastrophes that could have pushed China back into chaos and foreign manipulation. The response was decisive, brutal, and deliberately unforgettable, because the goal was not just to stop dissent, but to prevent memory from repeating itself. As China integrated into the global economy, joining the World Trade Organization in 2001 and becoming the world's manufacturing hub, it embraced globalization selectively, absorbing its benefits while resisting its political pressures. Free markets were tools. Free speech was a threat. Information, in particular, became a battlefield, because leaders understood that narratives shape legitimacy, and losing control of the story meant losing control of the state. This is why censorship expanded alongside economic growth, not because the government feared criticism, but because it feared uncontrolled interpretation, the possibility that history could be reframed in ways that weakened authority. The trauma of humiliation had taught that foreign influence rarely arrives with armies first. It arrives with ideas. As China's power grew, so did its sensitivity to borders, both physical and psychological. Territorial disputes in the South China Sea were framed not merely as strategic interests, but as corrections of historical injustice, restoring control over regions once lost during periods of weakness. The question was never whether these actions would alarm neighboring countries. The question was whether allowing uncertainty would invite future exploitation. The same logic shaped China's approach to Hong Kong, where the memory of a city taken during the Opium Wars and returned only after a century of foreign rule made autonomy feel like an unfinished chapter of humiliation rather than a stable compromise. When protests erupted, they were interpreted not as local grievances, but as warnings from history, reminders of how quickly disorder could spread if authority hesitated. Technology became the final layer of defense. Surveillance systems, data collection, facial recognition, and social monitoring were not introduced simply to control the population, but to eliminate unpredictability, because unpredictability had once destroyed an empire. To the outside world, this looked dystopian. To the leadership, it looked like insurance. Even China's foreign policy reflected this psychology, as it sought to reduce dependence on foreign supply chains, secure energy routes, and expand influence through infrastructure projects rather than direct conquest. Power was exercised quietly, methodically, and with an obsession for long-term leverage, because sudden moves had historically invited backlash. Yet the irony is that the very trauma that pushed China to seek security also made it deeply suspicious of the global order it now helped sustain. Every alliance is evaluated for hidden motives. Every criticism is viewed as potential containment. Every crisis is interpreted through the lens of past betrayal. And this creates a paradox. China is strong, but it does not feel safe. It is influential, but it does not feel respected. It is powerful, but it behaves like a nation that still remembers what it was like to kneel. And that memory continues to shape decisions in ways that often confuse or alarm the rest of the world. Because when trauma guides power, even dominance feels fragile. Today, China stands once again at the center of global power, influencing markets, technology, diplomacy, and security on a scale unmatched in its modern history. Yet beneath this rise lies a persistent anxiety that strength can vanish faster than it was built. Every policy choice, every red line, and every sudden display of firmness is shaped by a single historical question that never stopped echoing, which is, what happens if China ever becomes weak again? This is why compromise is often interpreted as danger rather than diplomacy, because history taught Chinese leaders that concessions made under pressure rarely end pressure. They invite more of it. It is why foreign criticism is framed not as disagreement, but as containment, because past humiliation came wrapped in moral language about trade, order, and civilization. It is why unity is enforced so aggressively, because fragmentation once opened the door to invasion, famine, and collapse. And it is why the state invests so heavily in shaping memory, education, and narrative, because forgetting the past would risk repeating it. To many outside observers, this behavior appears excessive, authoritarian, or even paranoid, but within China's historical framework, it feels logical, defensive, and necessary. Trauma does not disappear when power returns. It waits, it watches, and it whispers reminders of how quickly everything once fell apart. The tragedy is that this same trauma that protected China from external domination also limited its ability to trust, to relax control, and to fully believe that the world has changed. As China moves deeper into the 21st century, its greatest challenge may not come from foreign rivals, economic slowdowns, or military standoffs, but from the unresolved question of whether a nation shaped by humiliation can ever feel secure without absolute control. Because if history has taught China anything, it is that the world is unforgiving to the weak. But history has not yet answered whether strength built on fear can ever truly be at peace. And that question does not belong only to China. It belongs to everyone who lives in a world increasingly shaped by its decisions. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think China's actions today are a rational response to its past, or do you think history is being used to justify control in the present? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation matters more than ever. If you found this documentary insightful, support the channel by liking the video so more people can see it. And if you want more deep, investigative history that explains not just what happened, but why it still matters, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next story.